Good afternoon and welcome to the Institute for Church Leadership. My name is Andy. Glad you're here and excited about our first one of the year today. And I want to let you know our speaker, DiOrio, has a book out, Trivial Pursuits, and you can buy that in the back for just $10 today if you'd like to do that. The subtitle is Why Your Real Life is More Than Media, Money, and the Pursuit of Happiness. Ian knows about that because of his upbringing, which we'll mention in a little bit, but he's got some history with that. So you might want to pick that up anytime after today. You can just walk back to that table right in the back there. Before we get started, too, I want to mention we've got about 8, I think, Nebraska Christian students serving right now in Houston on cleanup, and I think that's really, really neat. They decided through a local church, Calvary Christian Church, to head down there with a group and do some cleanup. So weren't able to get a picture back in time, but to show you. But I've got 8 students down there doing some work. Normally they'd be sitting right here with us, but real excited that they're taking advantage of an opportunity there to serve in Houston. So grateful for that. Also wanted to mention there's probably some food left. If you want a little bit more, please feel free to head out there and get another one of those brownies or something if there's any left. Man, those were good. That's all I've had is a brownie so far. So eat dessert first. That's what we do here at the Institute. Hey, today's speaker, Ian, he has a unique story. His upbringing included being introduced to electronic dance music about 13 years old. And he not only got introduced to the music, but also the scene that comes with that music at a time when he was very vulnerable and impressionable. And long story short, became a rave DJ for a handful of years before ending up on a mission trip with the church, again, not knowing Jesus really, and again, long story short, became a pastor and has recently taken over church and turned it around, and it's growing, and amazing things are happening. I would really love it if you would give an Institute welcome to our speaker, Ian DiOrio.
That's so fun. All right. Hey, so grateful to be with you guys, and they told me I'd have walk-up music, and so I didn't know if it was going to be like Eye of the Tiger or Justin Timberlake, and I see some reverb, and so I'll make sure I don't walk around too much. Hey, you guys doing well today? It's going to be a great day. I'm grateful to be with you. I come out all the way from Southern California, and I did not know it was going to be raining here, so I'm grateful to be with you, but Southern California, we've actually had some rain recently, too. So I want to kind of first just get into my story a little bit. I want to tell you a little bit about my spiritual journey, and then we're going to get into like a concrete, practical investigation on how you lead change. And whether you're a church leader or you're a parent or you're a business leader or you're a professor, change is the one factor of life that you cannot resist. And so I want to give you some tools to think about that today. But first, I want to get into my story a little bit. Yes, that is me. I was a young person, young and impressionable, as you were just told by Andy. And when I was basically 13 years old, I decided I knew what I wanted to do with my life. My cousin, she was a promoter of rave and club culture in Los Angeles. If you don't know what that is, just go chicka, 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 chicka over and over again, and you'll get clear about what rave and club music is. But I basically, at 15 years old, knew what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a DJ, and I wanted to die a senior citizen DJ. I mean, I thought my life would be given over to this with absolute effectiveness. I did this from basically 15 till about 21. I was a high school dropout, so do you feel really confident in what I'm going to share with you today? Real optimistic about the content. But I dropped out of high school. I came from a broken family. I didn't meet my father till I was 30. Came from a drug and alcohol addicted family. And so when I told my family I wanted to not go to school, pay my own bills by making music, they said, that sounds great. We'll have one less child to deal with. So that's really wonderful. So I did that. I pursued music, and I pursued the entertainment industry with all of my heart. I wanted to be either a famous actor or a famous musician. I became neither, so that's okay. But I pursued music at such a deep level, and then I ended up being a party promoter. I used to throw raves and clubs all across the country. I used to throw parties with 5,000-10,000 people. We'd rent out a coliseum, and we'd do all-night after parties. And just by a show of hands, has anyone ever been to a rave? Do you even know what I'm talking? It's a lot different than country music. Let me just tell you that, okay? It's a lot different than a Garth Brooks concert. So it's a very different culture. But when I was 20, a couple things happened that shifted my life trajectory, and I won't get into the details of that, but basically I had a friend take his life, and that really jacked me up, broke my heart, awoke me to lots of the problems in the world, and I just went through a series of suffering. And long story short, I ended up in relationship with some Christians. I ended up going on a missions trip the week after my 21st birthday, where I spent 4 days in Vegas, and you know they say what happens in Vegas ends up on Facebook, right? So that's really what, so I went to Vegas, and then when I came back, I was invited to go on this missions trip to Mexico, and they said, hey, you want to come with us? And I said, sure. What time are you leaving? They said 5:30 in the morning. I'm like, oh my gosh, you have faith in God. Absolutely you do, if you think I'm going to get up that early. I ended up going, and I found Christ on that missions trip. I experienced the grace of God and the love of God like I'd never experienced before. I experienced this deep calling in my life. I went to a pastor, and I said, I want to do what you do. He said, you want to be a pastor? And I said, is that what you do? Like, I didn't know really if that's what he did. And he said, don't you need to accept Jesus first? And I said, is that like a prerequisite of being a pastor? You got to get the Jesus part figured out before you go lead a church. I figured out that's true, by the way. You need to get the Jesus part figured out before you lead a church. Well, God kind of took me on a quick trajectory. I went to Hope International University. I know that we're related to that school now. And I got saved at 21. And by the time I was 24, I was speaking at a church of about 7,000 people in the heart of Orange County. I have no idea what those people were thinking, because they just saw this young, impressionable, desirous young man who wanted to make an impact for Jesus. And so I worked at a church called Rock Harbor, and if you look to the top, that's our Easter. We would have something like 15 to 18,000 people come and join us for our Easter services. It would just be an amazing thing. We'd do baptism, sometimes baptize 500 people, at Easter. Just an amazing time. Well, below is the church I served at prior to the church I serve at now. That's Eastside Christian Church, and I know Gene Apple has been here many times, and Gene's a significant leader in my life, and he's somebody who's really helped and guided me in my journey. I served at Eastside as a teaching pastor, college pastor for nearly 6 years, and then God gave me this desire to be a lead pastor. And so I thought to myself, well, I worked at these great churches. I'm just going to go to a church just like this one. I'm going to go to some big box mega church somewhere out there in the world. They have a machine that prints money, and everything is going to go perfect from now on. But that's not really what God's call in my life was. While I was transitioning out of Eastside, both encouraged by Gene and understood myself I was called to be a senior pastor, I got a call from a church called Ukaipa Christian Church. Now, has anyone ever heard of Ukaipa? Awesome. Awesome. I didn't hear of Ukaipa either. I'm from the heart of Orange County, and so they called me, they said, we're at Ukaipa Christian Church, and I literally didn't know where it's at. But if you've heard of Palm Springs, anybody ever heard of Palm Springs, California? So if you're driving to Palm Springs, you'll pass my church on the way to Palm Springs. We're about 45 minutes from Palm Springs, and we're kind of at the base of a mountain, so it's kind of a unique part of California. It's very rural. We have 4 seasons. Yes, we will get snow, and it's kind of a different part. So when you think California, you think Hollywood and skinny jeans and, the Kardashians, right? But, that's not my area. I grew up my area is very rural, and actually it's just a very unique area as a pocket in California. And when I came to this church, the church had been declining 100 people, $100,000 every single year like clockwork. If the trajectory continued, the church probably had about 10 years of life left, and then it would end up having to sell a building and go through lots of painful experiences. By the way, this year, 5,000 to 7,000 churches are going to close their doors, say their last songs, sing their last prayers. They're going to be done this year. And so we were fearful of that happening here. I interviewed for the job, and they hired me, they voted me in, but as soon as I started, there just were problems and challenges, and this is what I realized about change. Most people think that they like change, but most people don't like change. Most people like being in charge of the change. They don't like being changed. And so change is a very difficult thing, but here's the one thing about life. The one constant of life is change. Have you looked in the mirror lately? Right? If not, you're going to be a college student now, and then 10 years from now, you'll look in the mirror, 20 years from now, you'll look in the mirror. You'll just see change. And change is just happening. It's happening all the time. Well, this was a church that was kind of very resistant to change, and yet they were some people in the church were very prayerful and hopeful for a new day. So they invited me in, and the first thing I did was I said, we need to have some values that are going to guide us as a church. We need to know what we're about and what we're going for, because if we don't know what we're about and what we're going for, we will never be able to hit the target. So I try to unify the congregation around 4 values. And we have 4 values at my church: pursue God, progress together, provide hope, and prepare leaders. And all of those are filters for our ministry. I'll get into a little bit about what challenges come with change, but I wanted to just start off with the story before I get into the nuts and bolts on how you lead change. I've been at the church now for about 3.5 years, and God's really done a great thing. We've seen a church that was dying and declining, 100 people, $100,000 every year, to now we're a church of roughly 1,500 people. That number just got boosted in terms of baptisms this weekend. We've baptized 47 people this week, so we're nearly, amen, you know. I like it. And so this was like recently, and we're nearly baptizing 600 people within a little over 3 years. So we've seen a lot happen. The church has probably grown by 1,000 people. We radically changed the church. One of the things we did this last April was change the name from Ukaipa Christian Church. Yeah, that was a cool name, don't get me wrong. They're very, very brand well. But we changed it to Active Church. Now, we were asked, why did we call the church Active Church? I said this in an earlier conversation, but we asked one question. What is the number one chief sin in our community that God would call us to combat and go against? In Orange County, the chief sin was ambition. Everybody wanted something, wanted to be something, wanted to own something, and wanted to be seen as somebody who had things. So everybody owned houses they couldn't afford, cars they couldn't afford, wore clothes they couldn't afford to impress people they didn't even like. Ukaipa, we asked that question, and the chief sin was apathy. People not believing for a better day. We have more mobile home parks in my city than any other city per capita in the United States. A city of 60,000 people roughly, and we have 56, I believe, mobile home parks. 21% of the people in my community live below the poverty line. We see multiple generational brokenness. Grandma's addicted to crystal meth, mom's addicted to crystal meth, granddaughter's addicted to crystal meth. And so we said, we want to be a church that attacks apathy, and we want to be a church that's the opposite of apathetic. So we wrote down on some scorecards, what was the opposite of apathy? And eventually, we came up with this name, Active Church. And this last Easter, we kicked off the name, and our people have really embraced it. So here's a picture. Oops, I skipped too forward. Picture of just last Sunday at our church. We've renewed everything from our vision, our values, our mission, our staff, our focus. We've seen tremendous growth and significant impact. And I want to tell you now what I've learned and give you some tools, so maybe when you go back to your organization, your church, your family, whatever it is, you will have the opportunity to begin to lead change. And here's the thing I know. If you're not changing, you're dying. If you're not growing, you're dying. That's the way that life is. And we need to think about change, and we need to be ahead of the curve or change, or we're going to find ourselves behind the curve of change. And by the way, I believe there's no more dynamic organization in the world than Jesus Christ. I've worked in the entertainment industry. I've been an actor. I worked for the president of Warner Brothers. I've traveled the world doing entertainment content curation, and I will give my life to the Church of Jesus because there's no greater organization. No greater organization. But here's the deal. Here's the deal. If we're going to see flourishing churches, we need to think about change, and we need to make sure that the church is on the cutting edge of change, and we're change makers rather than change resistors. Now, I know most people, they often resist change, and I want to talk about why we do that. You've heard this quote that change is difficult and not changing is fatal. Has anyone ever heard that quote? Change is difficult, but not changing is fatal. This is what's called the organizational S-curve. And maybe some of you have seen this before. But this is how you chart organizational growth. And you can do this for a business. You can do this for a marriage, by the way. You can do this for a church. So the way organizations start is every organization had a start date. Nebraska Christian College had a start date. There were some people who believed that Christian education should be a value. We should set up an institution to train pastors and leaders for the next generation. And by the way, that had a start date. And typically what happens is you start an organization, it's a company, it's a university, it's a church, And you have some initial wins, because if you don't have some initial wins, you have no story to tell. There is no university, there is no church, there is no company. But what happens after a while is you reach what's called plateau. Plateau is where you're seeing lots of movement, but very little momentum. You're seeing lots of activity, but very little action and very little accomplishment. And people plateau all the time. And by the way, like I said, you could chart a marriage on this. You get married, and some of you are going to get married, and you're going to stand before people, and you're just going to lie through your teeth. I'm going to love you forever. We're never going to have fights. It's going to be hugs and roses and puppies and cuddles for the rest of the world. And then you're going to be married for a little while. Any married folk in the house? Then you're going to be married for a little while. And then you get that point in your marriage where you've been married for a while, if you know what I'm talking about. And you have to make a decision. Are we going to change, or are we going to die? Well, we know the statistics about marriage. Over 50% of marriages end in divorce. Well, why does that happen? Because they plateau in their marriage, and then in plateau mode, you have a choice. Are we going to decline, or are we going to be renewed? Are we going to make a difference, and are we going to go in a different direction? By the way, this is how you can chart your personal spiritual life. You can chart your growth. You can chart your church, chart your organization. And most organizations actually decline and fail. Here's a way that you could think about it in terms of the church. You have the birth of the church, and you have early growth, but eventually you get stuff like air conditioning, and you get nice comfy chairs, and you get ministries that you like, and you have a group of people that you like doing life with, and you don't want any other people because you've really gotten deep with these people, and you really know these people. And maybe they're a certain type of person, and you don't want anybody who's not that type of person in here because we're just a deep community. We have deep, intimate relationships with each other. We just hate everybody else. And that's where you start to, we call that maturity. The problem is, maturity can be filled with excuses that keep you from improvement. Because maturity says, we have arrived. Isn't that right? Maturity says, we're there. We got it right. Some of you think that in your parenting. I got it. I've matured. I got it right. Many people think that in church. I've matured. I got it right. But the problem is, if you oversense that you've matured, you under-improve. Another part of the organizational life cycle with churches is when churches get really comfortable and they get really kind of stuck in their ways, they eventually start to decline, and they don't know that they're declining. And eventually, sometimes, they decline so much that they waited too long, and there's too much pressure to change the organization. So if you look at the top, when you start to slip as an organization, you got to refocus. You got to say, hey, we're going to focus on some different things. But notice, if you're declining, you have to restructure. You got to change everything about the organization. And if you're dying, you have to give rebirth. I believe my church was in the declining stage, which means when I came into our church, we had to restructure everything, change everything, because if we didn't, we would have died. It might have been a slow bleed, a 5-10-year slow death, but it would have been a death, and Jesus Christ said, the gates of hell will not overcome my church. But when he said that, he certainly wasn't talking about individual local churches. He was talking about the church collectively, because every day churches close. Every day churches sell their building. And the reason they do is because they don't ask poignant questions at critical moments that give them the power and the vision to make the change. So I believe when you're going to make a change in your church, one of the most important aspects of leading change is identifying where you are in your life cycle and what changes need to be made. I want you to think about that, your organization. How many of your pastors, leaders? How many of your pastors, leaders know that there's changes you want to make in your church? If you don't identify where you are on the life cycle, is it a 2-degree shift change? Is it a complete reboot? Is it a complete restructure? Is it a complete rebirth? You will not be able to identify what changes you need to be made. I'll give you a perfect example of an organization that failed to change in time because it didn't know its life cycle, and of course, it's Blockbuster. I was doing this slide in front of my 7-year-old son. And I was doing this slide, my son goes to me, he goes, Dad, what is Blockbuster? I said, honey, that's a place where, you used to go get videos and movies and red vines and DVDs. And he said, Dad, why don't people just watch it on their phone? My 7-year-old son. Now, how many of you even know what Blockbuster is? Yeah, it's awesome, awesome. How many of you have gone to a Blockbuster in the last year? Oh, that's right, because there aren't any. That's right. Now, I want to read you a quote from the board-issued statement that Blockbuster issued in 1999. This is the greatest one. It said in 1999, investor concern over the threat of new technologies is overstated. All this stuff about streaming, all this stuff about downloads, people will always want to pack up their family in the minivan and go to the Blockbuster and choose to get Red Vines or Skittles and pick out their favorite movie and return it back at the place. Investor concern over new technologies is overrated. By the way, you have millions of people in your church. Those changes are overrated. The pastor is just going with the wind. He doesn't really know what's going on. Blockbuster went bankrupt because it did not adjust quick enough to the cultural context it was in. I fear the church will do the same if we do not clearly identify where we are at, where the culture is going, and what changes we need to make. Blockbuster had the opportunity to buy a company called Netflix for $200 million. And they said, nah. Netflix this next year will clear billions, with a B, billions of dollars. Blockbuster had the opportunity to buy them and didn't because it did not understand where they were on the life cycle of change. Does that make sense to you? Question, why do people resist change? Why do people resist change? I mean, you're going to change no matter what. Everything's going to change no matter if you like it or not. Everything's going to change regardless if you work hard to keep it. You could go in a room right now, sit in a hyperbaric chamber and say to yourself with your fingers crossed, I'm never going to change, I'm never going to change, I'm never going to change, I'm never going to change. And for 40 years you can do that, and guess what's going to happen to you? You're going to change. Because change is the one thing that life is always doing. The philosopher Heraclitus said that if you step your foot into a river and pull your foot out of the river and put your foot back in the river, you've put your foot back into a different river because the river has moved on. Change is the one constancy of life. And that's why I fear people who resist change, because what they're ultimately resisting is reality. So why do people resist change? I think there's some reasons. I'll start with no. People resist change because, I don't got time to do it. We don't have time to change. Blockbuster probably said, we don't have time to build a whole new team and think about digital video streaming. We don't have, we're building stores and we're supplying them with inventory, and we don't have any time. Why do people resist change? Because they have no power. They feel like, you know what? I have no power to change something in my life. I have no power to change something in the church. And so somebody else trying to change something, oh gosh, you know what? I have no power to stop them or start them, and the people just see powerlessness as one of the reasons that they don't change. Churches use this one as a reason not to change all the time. No money. Anybody in this church have had an idea shot down because you didn't have money to do it? Anybody ever at one time in your life? During the change of my church, going from Ukaipa Christian Church to Active Church, we got down to $100 in the bank account, with a $2.5 million building loan and 14 staff. And I went to my staff and I said, not having money is not a reason for not doing ministry. A lot of nots. Not having money is no excuse for us not doing ministry. We got to get creative. We got to think differently. We got to figure out ways to do this, to finance this, to make things happen. Another reason why people don't embrace change is trust. Trust is built on two features. Are you ready? You should write this down. Trust is built on character and competency. And people will resist change until they trust your character and they believe in your competency. For instance, if I know a guy who has amazing character and he's a janitor, and then I find out I have a tumor, I'm not going to let his character be the very reason I give him a scalpel and have him cut into me. I want somebody who's what? Competent, right? I want a surgeon. Now, if I go to the best surgeon in the world and they're telling me that he's kind of a scoundrel in his private life, frankly, as long as he's the best to do the surgery, I'm cool with getting the surgery. In church work, character and competency are the ingredient for trust. And when people don't trust your character and they don't trust your competency, change is resisted and it's slowed down. So trust is one of the reasons people resist change. No understanding, and I think this is true for church work. So many of us want to initiate a change without first laying the groundwork for understanding and helping people come to see why this change is necessary. And I think the number one is no need. If you think you have no need to change, take that as a sign that you have many reasons to change. If you ever think to yourself, things are going good, we have no need to change it, think of Blockbuster next time. I really want you to do that. I like this quote by Peter Singh. He says, people don't resist change, they resist being changed. People don't resist change, they resist being changed, which means in leadership, it's your job to figure out how to woo people and win people and motivate people and encourage people so that they embrace your change. Here's a big block of ice. Say I wanted to turn this block of ice into a sculpture of the bird that is called a phoenix. How would I go about doing that? What would be the first thing I would do? Most people, they would get a chainsaw, and then they would start, and maybe at the end of it, you get something like this, right? Well, that's how most people go about changing things in the church, with their chainsaw. There's actually two ways to get an ice sculpture. One is you get out the chainsaw and you start cutting away and you start doing it. Another is you get that big block of ice and you slowly melt it and collect the water in buckets. And then you make a mold of the phoenix. And then you pour that same water into that mold and then you refreeze it. And you get the same thing. You see it with ice cubes every day in your freezer. Now, the first approach required a chainsaw. Lots of the water and the ice was left on the ground, and there was lots of damage done to get the beautiful picture. The second approach, the slow mold, unfreeze, refreeze approach, is a much more sophisticated approach to do it. Ask yourself, this change I want to make in my life, my family, my church, is this a chainsaw approach? Do I have to do it quickly? Is there going to be a lot of backlash and outcomes, or should I go about it slowly and take time? I want to be completely forthright with you. I was not in a context where we could have slowly done change. And the reason is health determines speed. Health determines speed. If you are sick and you go to the doctor and they say you have stage 1 cancer, and you could probably think about, I'm going to work out, I'm going to change my health habits, I'm going to get fit, go homeopathic medicine, and maybe do some medicinal treatments from the doctors, but I'm going to go slow because it's a stage 1 cancer. If you go to the doctor and they say you have a stage 4 tumor and we have to cut it out this Friday, you will go, wow, that's going really fast. Why is it going really fast? Because your health determines speed. And if you are sick as an organization or as a leader or your corporation or your church or your business, if it has a tumor in it that requires surgery, you have to move quickly. If it's a healthy church, things are going well, you could take a slow approach and get the same results. So I'm not telling you to go fast or slow. I'm telling you, if you want to make a change, first think about the health, and then you need to think about the changes that you need to make. Now, I want to talk about the culture that we're living in, because speed is so different now in our culture than it's ever been before. We are living in the most unique era of human history. The smartphone has been in existence for how many years? Does anybody know? 10 years. The top 5 corporations could not exist apart from the smartphone. Facebook, Instagram, Uber, Lyft. Massive corporate redefinition, one device. We're living in a time where scholars call it VUCA, and maybe you've heard of this. But we live in a time of increased volatility, which means things are going to go faster. There's going to be more unpredictable changes without clear patterns or trends. ever before. We live in a time of increasing uncertainty, frequent disruptive changes where the past is not a very good predictor of the future. We live in a time of increased complexity, multiple complex, intertwined technological, societal, geopolitical, and ecological evolutions. And we live in a time of ambiguity, little clarity on what is real or true, and difficult to predict impact of actions or initiatives. When leaders talk about our culture, when cultural exegetes think about our culture, they use this phrase VUCA, which means this: if you think the decisions you will have to make as a church next year are going to be the same as this year, you do not understand the culture that you're living in. Because the culture is going to shift quicker than you have time to think about it. And I think the church needs to be on the cutting edge of change rather than resistors of change. But regardless if we want change or not, Steve Jobs never called me and asked me if it was okay for him to make the smartphone. He just did it. Virtual reality, artificial intelligence, these technologies are happening right now. Elon Musk assumes by 2025 we'll have only driverless cars in this country. Oh, that can't happen, sure. If you think that can't happen, possibly you don't understand the culture we live in. And it's not just the coast that are going to be impacted by this volatility. It's going to be everywhere. Everything's going to be changed. And so the church, I believe, needs to be in a position where we are constantly having one ear open to the culture and one ear open to the scripture and figuring out how we can lead in the middle of this complexity. Here's another example of the way the world used to be and the world as it is. The old world, there was stability. Anybody remember stability? It was a nice time. Stability was a good thing, right? There was certainty, right? Certainty. Stock market's always going to go up. Country's always going to be great. America's going to be great. Everything's going to go well. Simplicity. Does anybody just long for simplicity? Where I come from, there's this restaurant called In-N-Out. I don't know if you've ever eaten at it, but there's always a line at In-N-Out, and one of the reasons people love In-N-Out is because it takes this complex thing called the hamburger and just reduces it down to simplicity. That's all we do here. Hamburgers, fries, and shakes, figure it out. But we don't live in a world of In-N-Out. We live in a world of Amazon. We live in a world of unbelievable complexity. Clarity, knowing what you're supposed to do, when you're supposed to do it. That was the old world. Now the new world is full of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And the difference is from comfort to discomfort. People always say, I feel on edge, I feel stressed out. That's what the culture is doing to you. And as Christians, we cannot just fold up our arms and go, well, that's the world. We're just going to do our church thing. We're going to get in our holy huddle, and we're just going to sit down and sing How Great Thou Art until Jesus comes back. I believe Jesus said something about the world. For God so loved the... This is God's world. And even if it's getting more vulnerable and chaotic and unclear, it's still God's world. And we're still God's people. And God's still calling us to impact his world. We don't get to pick the conditions of the world. If I got to pick the conditions of the world, there would be a donut shop on every corner, and I wouldn't have to go anywhere to get all my groceries, and I would just be able to sit in a massage chair for 12 hours a day and be able to get all my work done. I mean, if we had the predictable patterns of the world that we would choose for ourselves, the world would look really differently. But the world does not care about your opinions. But God cares about the world, which means if you don't carefully investigate what the world is becoming and what it's doing, you will find yourself so behind the 8 ball of change that you will not know how to make any decisions. So, how should we go about leading change? How should we go about leading change? I think we should ask ourselves 3 questions before we begin any change initiative. First question, am I the right person to lead this change? For instance, I've seen this happens all the time with youth pastors and senior pastors. Now, I'm 36 years old, so I don't know what that makes me. To some of you, I might be old. Some of you, I might be young. I just feel very confused about my age. And so I talk about youth pastors now as a senior pastor, and I'm like, okay, I'm in that stage of life where I'm now criticizing the youth pastors, right? But I know so many youth pastors who want to change something in their church, and they want to change it now, and they want to make it happen now, and they make moves to make it happen now, and then they get resistance because they never ask the question, am I the right person to lead this change? So think of a change you want to make in your organization. That's great. You're going to have to make some. First question, am I the person to make this? I would tell you this. If you're in the organization and you're not the senior leader and you want to make changes in the organization, you're probably going to sign your termination notice without going through your senior leader and involving them in the process, right? Because people don't mind change, they just mind being changed. And when people are trying to change things at the top and get resistance, probably a sign that you're not the right person to lead the change. So ask yourself, anywhere in life, am I the right person to lead the change? Second thing, am I committed to seeing this change through stability? I think it is a spiritual malpractice to go into a church as a leader and cause a bunch of change and upset those godly people and cause frustration, and then when things are hairy and tough, you just bail out and let the board of elders deal with it. I knew the second that things started to go crazy in my church that I was signing a 5-year contract. I just knew that. I knew minimally I'm going to have to see this through stability. Now, I've been there 3.5 years, and I realized, gosh, I mean, we're much better than we were, but if I left today, would the church flourish? And we could say all the things we want about, oh, well, it's not built on personality. Sure, right, but there's leadership in every organization, and when central leadership goes, there's effects, there's impact. So I have to ask the question, when can I leave my church and it be stable and not suffer without me being present? And I will refuse to lead my church until I believe when I take my hand off the wheel that it is going to continue and flourish. So if you are not willing to stay through stability, I would say do not initiate the change. Last question. Ask yourself the question, and this is a good one, am I ready to deal with the emotional backlash that comes with every change initiative? Maybe you have a choir in your church. That was funny, guys. This is supposed to be funny. That's a humorous thing. People get real emotional about change. Do you understand that? And I understand that. And I think one of the reasons we get emotional about change is possibly, we have over-identified with the wrong things. Jesus said, I will build my church. He never said, I will build a hymnal. Jesus said, I will build my church. He never said, I will build buildings. Jesus said, I will build my church. He never said, I will build VBSs. Are VBSs good? Are hymnals good? Are buildings good? Awesome. Love them. Great. Thank God for them. But if we emotionally attach to those things that keep us from flourishing into the right things, or the things that are going to take us in a new way, we might experience this. I'll tell you, when I came to my church, my interview meeting, I wasn't even hired at the church yet. The board let go of a staff member that should have been let go on a Monday. I had a Wednesday and I had a Thursday night meeting with the congregation. I said, I want to meet with them. I want to share my vision. I don't want this to be a bait and switch. I want them to know what they're getting and know who I am. 40 people came in matching shirts that first Wednesday meeting, throwing chairs, screaming, cussing, and shutting down the meeting. True story, hand on the Bible. The chief of the police in my city was the chairman of my board. This man was shot with an AK-47. He started crying. He put a microphone down, and he said, Ian, you could just leave. You could just leave. And I don't know about you. I mean, I'm 5'6", but I'm kind of spicy, you know what I'm saying? So I said, no, I'm not going to do that. So I stood before a crowd that looked a lot like this one. And I said, this is before I even got hired. And I said, listen, I don't know what pain you're feeling right now that would cause you to act in this way. I'm not going to address that. I'm going to tell you who I am. And then this Sunday, you guys get to vote on whether or not you want what I'm bringing and who I am. And if you don't want that, that's great, because this doesn't look very fun. And if you want it, you need to know I'm going to change everything. Everything. Choose wisely. They gave me a 94% affirmation. I think the elders lied to me. I think they lied to me. Just kidding. They voted me in. They voted me in theoretically. They did not approve of my changes practically. My wife and I we have infertility in our marriage. We couldn't have biological kids of our own. So I have 3 adopted black kids, which is really fun. You know, me and my short white wife, everywhere we go, people go, "Oh, are your kids adopted?" And I always go, "No." God works in mysterious ways, you know what I'm saying? Who knows? Who knows? And I grew up in the hood, and I grew up in a hip-hop culture, so, you know, I'm just like, people look at me and they're like, what happened here? I think it's so fun, too, like 3 or 4 generations from now, my great-great-grandkids are going to look back, and they're going to want to know about their great-great-grandparents, and they're going to see 2 short, shriveled-up white people from Yucaipa. They're going to be like, how did that happen? We don't know what happened. We had a baby. We went to the medical visits with the mom. We're there for the delivery of the baby. The mom said, we're gonna give you this baby. We want to seal the deal. Young girl wanted to give the baby, and as soon as that baby came, 3 days later, the mom changed her mind. And I learned something there. Everyone can give lip service to change verbally. Oh, I love it, 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 I love it. But when the cost of change comes practically, people will refuse change. So I think your best thing to do as a leader is put the pain before them and give them an answer for it. Great leaders absorb pain. Great leaders absorb pain. Poor leaders give pain. You know you're a lame leader when you start to blame people. That's why it's lame. Be lame, blame. Get it? Great leaders absorb pain. I stood before my congregation. I said, I know a lot of us are hurting right now. I know you've been without a pastor for a year. I know that many of you are confused about some of the decisions of the elders. I know that many of you are hurt by this. But I want you to trust me, and I want you to get to know me, and I want you to learn to have meetings with me. And I sat with hundreds of people those first weeks, and I had people cuss me out at Yogurtland. I had people come into my office and tell me they weren't going to pay the tithe. I had people come threaten me. I had people videotape me and record me at multiple dinners trying to catch me in some kind of conspiracy while I was eating chips and salsa. Lots of bad things happen over Mexican food, right? And I tried as best as I can to honor Jesus and absorb their pain. But I did not let their challenges keep me from the vision that God gave me. And if you can't absorb pain and still lead in the direction that God's called you, I don't think you probably should set up for a change initiative. John Cotter, he wrote a book called Leading Change. I encourage you to buy it. This isn't with me, but I did follow this model when I came, and I want to encourage you with it, and we're almost wrapping up here. But there's 8 steps to making change, and there's really 3 areas that you have to focus on. First is creating the climate for change. Second is engaging and enabling the organization for change. And lastly is implementing and sustaining for change. The first thing you must do if you're going to start a change initiative is you have to create urgency. Most people change when it's too late. But if you go to the doctor and they give you a diagnosis and they say you need to lose 30 pounds and cut back your sugar and you got to get healthier and quicker than you have, that doctor's diagnosis creates urgency. I think one of the greatest things leaders can do is create urgency. I would say if we are not reaching the next generation of our kids, who is? Who is? I'll tell you who is. I worked in media. I worked in Hollywood. They're going to reach their kids. And guess what? They're not trying to make them Christ-like. They're trying to make them consumers. And they don't care about their soul and their personal lives. So if we can think that this is a slow-go process, we're going to miss a generation of people. We got to create urgency. Secondly, you got to form a powerful coalition. I said this earlier, but I wrote a 4-quadrant matrix. And I said, I need to start talking to people and gathering people together who fit in these 4 molds. I need to talk to people who are older than me numerically and people who are younger than me numerically. And I need to talk to people who've been at the church longer than me and been at the church since I've come. And I need to create a powerful coalition so when I go share vision, they're ready there to receive it. I need to create a vision for change. Without vision, there is division. You know, the Bible says without vision, people perish. I like to say without vision, they go to somebody else's parish because vision is what unifies us, and you got to figure out a lasting vision. Fourth, you got to communicate that vision. Most pastors, they go up to the mountain, they're Moses, they come back with the tablets, they know the vision, and they wonder why people aren't following because they don't know how to translate the vision God's given to them into practical communication into the vision with the people. 5, you got to empower people for action. I make very little decisions in my organization. Very little. I make sure we know what we're going for, what our culture is, what our outcomes are, what our metrics are, and then I empower people to make the change. Much of the good stuff in my organization has become a result of me taking the lid off of my leaders. You got to create quick wins. One of the things you got to celebrate, like we baptized more people one day than we did the entire year before as a church. And I got up before my church and I said, guys, we baptized more people one day than we did the entire year. And it didn't make anybody excited. But now, the Sunday before we came, I baptized again, like 36 people, 12 people the week before. When I tell my church that, they celebrate, they give. They're passionate about it because they want the win. Then you got to build on change. Change takes time, and you got to make sure you establish structures and systems that will sustain the change, and then you got to make it stick. Last thing is you got to build flexible structures that support health and growth. Build flexible structures that support health and growth. Jesus tells a parable, doesn't he? He tells a story in Luke chapter 5 about wineskins. He says in Luke 5, "No one pours new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the new wine will burst the skins, the wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, new wine must be poured into new wineskins. And no one, after drinking the old wine, wants the new, for they say the old is better," right? He's saying that if you pour new wine into these wineskins that are old, the expansion of the new wine is going to burst those wineskins. So you got to keep old for old and new for new. But Jesus is saying the structure is as important as the substance. The structure is as important as the substance. And many of us, we're all substance people. We want to preach the Bible. We want to lead people in worship. We want to encourage people to Jesus. But the structure is just as, maybe more important than the substance. John Carter, who wrote that book, Leading Change, he says, bureaucratic cultures can smother those who want to respond to shifting conditions. If you have bureaucracy, for me to sell a guitar and buy a piano in my church, I had to get 3 different committee signatures. 3 different committee signatures. I always like what G.K. Chesterton said. He said, "I've searched all the parks and all the cities and found no statues of committees." Committees can be often the reason we don't change because we do this. Well, the committee has to agree on it, and then we have to pray about it, then we have to talk about it, then we have to think about it, and that committee has to sign off on it, and then the committee after that has to sign off. It becomes a hot potato where nobody stands up and says, "I'm going to lead this vision, and I'm going to make the change." Lastly, build processes rather than programs. Take people on a process where you get them involved in your church. You take them from a person who's a visitor to an attender to a leader to a greeter, and here's just a general funnel for how to do that. And I'll leave that up in a minute so you can take a picture. My last slide is Gandhi said, and I think it's a great wisdom, be the change you wish to see in the world. I pray that you be the change you wish to see in the church. Thanks for letting me be with you guys. I was going fast at the end.
Wow,
I didn't know
bro.
how much time we got.
Wow.
Fire hose, right?
It is. I need a new analogy. I'm tired of that one, though. We need a new illustration for drinking from a fire hose.
I don't know.
Work on that for me.
Exactly.
I want to start where you ended, and I need an example of a process you put in place.
Yep.
Instead of a program or whatever, but just a process you changed so that it was a process that would enable growth. I know this is top of mind. So
I got it. Quickly, I'll tell you one. When I was on staff at Eastside, I mentioned this earlier with Gene, we asked the question, how many ministries do we have to help adults grow spiritually? We didn't have one ministry. We didn't have 5 ministries. We didn't have 10 ministries. I think we had 33 ministries. If Gene's here and he corrects me, believe him, not me. But it was 33 different ministries. Gene said, we're going to pick 4. Do you know what that's called? Painful. And of course, everyone in that meeting just said their ministry. Like, I was like, college ministry must stay. We cannot lead the church unless we have a college program and a college ministry. And he's like, Ian, that seems a little selfish. No, Gene, that's how. Ask yourself the question too. How many of the ministries of the church are intended for outsiders versus insiders? The vast majority of programs in your church are for insiders, not outsiders. And therefore, you end up entertaining and making busy Christian disciples who could be using their free time to reach people for Christ and help build a strategic change in the church. So one of the things we did is we simplified our process and we think of pathway versus programs. We don't launch new programs in our church. We ask the question, how do we take people from our community down to our leadership. And we want to make that process as simple as possible. Elimination is the way that you do that. I know that's painful. Trust me, I know. But here's the deal. This will blow your mind. The more activity you do, the less effective ministry you will have, I believe. I think you need less activity and more effectiveness. Now, there's a great book that defends this with great metrics and research, Simple Church by Tom Rainer. Go read that book. I encourage you to read it. But we think in terms of pathway, not program. So we don't do a men's ministry. We don't do women's ministry. We don't do a million type of ministries. And people go, how can you build a church without that? Well, my church has grown by 1,000 people in a little over 3 years, and we baptized 600 people. Why? The power of focus. Now, who gets mad about us not having those ministries? The atheist in the community? The broken dad who's an alcoholic and has nobody to give him hope? No, it's people who are already established and already Christians. And I would think that the greatest need for us in this generation is to recover that evangelistic spirit and recover this desire to reach people for Christ, and therefore establish processes rather than programs to do that. And I know a process versus a program. If a program does not have a start and stop date, you should eliminate it. A process has a start and stop date. Here's our assimilation class. 5 weeks, then you're done, and you move on to the next level. Here's our discipleship class. Move on. Here's our leadership development class. And it's all taking people in a process. We don't ever have classes where it's like, well, we're the wisdom seekers, and we've been meeting for 45 years. Right? So I think that's one of the ways. I also say from a governance perspective, this is just my personal perspective, but I think governance, decision-making has to be led out in an empowerment model. So my board of directors, my elders, they function through what's called a policy governance, which means they don't make decisions about how I preach or how I lead. They make pre-done decisions that kind of create a playground for me to play in. And I meet 4 times a year, and if I violate one of those, that's when they come in. Other than that, I'm not encountering them. Now, people say, well, how are they serving the church? From a macro level, not a micro level, ask yourself, do you want more people micromanaging you or giving you a macro vision and empowering you? Most people don't want to be micromanaged. They want to give a macro vision and be empowered to achieve it.
Yeah. Yep.
He's like, is my boss here? I don't know,
I'm thinking it's really makes you think about what you've been doing and building and working on, right? As you try to think through this. And so I'm thinking back to when I was a youth pastor, what I'm doing now, all those things.
Yeah.
So talk about, I don't think you mentioned this specifically in this talk, but you mentioned it over there this morning. I thought it was very helpful understanding what we're talking about, and that was your 4 core values and how they lead into each other.
Yes.
Did you mention that?
Yeah.
Now?
So
talk about that.
Yeah, we came up with 4 core values, and they're pursue God, progress together, provide hope, and prepare leaders. That is the filter for what we do. They're all 2 words. And by the way, if your people can't tell you your vision back to you, it's not working. And so if your vision is, we want to disciple the world and the nations by edifying all believers and there's the slide. So we said we want to be able to ask anybody in our church, and if you come to my church in Yucaipa, I will give you permission to go ask people who have my activator shirts on, or volunteers, and say, hey, what are the 4 core values here? If they can't say it to you, I will fire them. So just kidding. But we came up with this process. We said the number one thing we want to do is help people pursue God. We didn't say who. We said we want to help people pursue God. And I mentioned this quickly earlier there, that all of us start the spiritual journey at a different level. I started at negative 150. I was a drug addict, high school dropout, rave DJ. That's who I was. And if a church assumed that I knew Leviticus or even the difference between the New Testament and the Old Testament, I teach New Testament now. And I remember being in my first Life of Christ class, and my father-in-law talked about the Samaritans, and I thought to myself, I have no idea what he's talking about. I was at the Harvest Crusade. I don't know if you know who that is. Greg Laurie, he does these big evangelistic crusades. Years ago, I was at the Harvest Crusade, and he said these words. The Apostle Paul said, and I look in front of me, because we're at a stadium, and I see this woman with a pen and paper, and she wrote down these words that changed my ministry for the rest of my life. Who is Paul? We assume so much about where people are at spiritually, and then we wonder why we're not reaching people who are far from God. So that pursue God is, hey, wherever you're at, if you're an atheist, and I'll tell this quick story. I told her earlier.
That's what I want you to do, right?
Yeah. So I'll tell you this quick. If you're an atheist, hey, come to church once in a while. If you're agnostic, ask some good questions. We have a woman in our church. Her name is Gina. Shows up every week with an active T-shirt on. She tithes $1,500 a month to my church, and she's an agnostic. And I asked her, I go, Gina, why are you doing this? She said, you guys have given me such a permission to ask questions and explore the spiritual thing without any pressure that I want to help create an environment like this for other people. So pursue God is one of our values. I wish Gina was with me today because she'd be like, hey, what's up? She literally asked me, she's like, I think Jesus is mean. He killed pigs one day. I was like, how do I answer that question? I won't eat bacon here ever again, I promise, right? So pursue God, but our next value is progress together. We want you to do life with people, right? So we have connection groups, small groups, whatever you want to call them, cell groups. That's the next level. Then we want to get people, actually in the order is different. We would say provide hope. We would want people to somehow serve. And by the way, I got saved on a missions trip. So if you have a policy at your church that Christians are only the ones who can go serve in Jesus' name, I would not have come to Christ in your church. So I was allowed to belong before I believed anything, before I signed a card, before I agreed to anything, and I think that is a good thing. And prepare leaders. We want to raise up leaders. By the way, even if you're not a Christian, if you come to my church, I want you to be a better leader. I always tell people, if you're an employer and you go to Active Church and you're a great employer, tell people you go to Active Church. And if you're an employer and you're not a great employer, tell people you go to First Baptist, because I don't want people to know that, I'm just kidding, that was funny, right? I want people to see your spirituality as a reflection of the leadership of your church. And I want people to be like, how come you're such a good employee? My church is teaching me how to be a leader. So we have leadership development programs. We've partnered with Hope in the past, but and so we start out with pursuing God, we end up being a leader. That's it.
It's awesome, man. Really quick. The last question is, how would you, practically speaking, help your church find eliminate and find a new way? Because that's going to be, is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But was there any one key ingredient or just one quick tip on that?
I think my context, there was just a lot of pain in the church. So there's 2 times I think you can move fast when it comes to change. A honeymoon and a crisis, right? Those are the 2 times. When people are just so elated that you're there and you're the new pastor, they're expecting you to make changes. So if you're in this honeymoon phase where, every time you talk it sounds like hymn music and every word you say is like the word of the Lord, I would lean into that and say, guys, I just love this place so much and we've learned to love each other so much and I want to see this church have 60 more years, 100 more years in this community, and thank you for the love you've given me. I want to give that love to other people. And so can we just, okay? Second thing, if you're in a crisis, do you know what people do in a crisis? They freeze. They freeze. They get terrified. And most people don't know they're in a crisis when they're in one. They find out they're in a crisis later because there's this thing called shock, right? In my context, there was such a shock and there was such a, that someone needed to stand up and say, we're not going to let the chaos and the craziness of this moment keep us from God's vision for this church. And I would have people come up to me and they'd say, well, I'm not going to give my tithe if you don't do what I want to do. And I would say, I'll eat dog food to advance this vision. When people know you're that serious, that I think most of us, we lead a change, maybe we're half-hearted into it, right? Yeah. And so it's like, that people can pick that out. They can pick out whether or not you're a hireling or if you're a shepherd. They can pick out whether or not you're there for the long. But when I would get people and they would give me resistance, I would as lovingly as I can, but as firmly as I could say, I am immovable. Do you know how Paul ends 1 Corinthians when he talks about the resurrection? He talks about Jesus' resurrection. By the way, I believe in it. I love it. I want to be it. I want to experience it. Paul ends his entire excursus on the resurrection where he talks about summum punatikon and different souls and bodies and fleshly spirits. And he ends the passage on the resurrection. He says, therefore be immovable, steadfast, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for you know that your labor is not in vain. I think too many of our leaders, my friends, are movable. The opinions of people move us. The backlash of criticism moves us. The fear of people's opinions moves us. I'll tell you, I told this story earlier. I have a guy in my church. He knocked on my door, and he scheduled a meeting with me. His name was Vinny. And I'm scared of anybody who makes a meeting with me whose name is Vinny. Right? You're like, oh gosh, is the mob coming to come talk to me, you know? And he came, and he walked in. He's just a normal-looking dude, dirty jeans, T-shirt, flip-flops. You wouldn't see anything. He's married to a woman in our church, and her parents are lifelong members, like founding members of our church. And they weren't too happy with the changes I was bringing, but I happened to baptize Vinny's daughters. I didn't even know that we did that. I happened to baptize them. So Vinny called a meeting with me, and I thought it was going to be a complaining meeting, a critical meeting. He comes and sits down. He says, I want to let you know, I've been watching you. I sit in the back. Probably never seen me before. I've been watching how you've responded. And I've seen people in the hallways come up to you with frowns and mean faces, and I've heard the criticism of my in-laws, and I've been watching. And I've never once seen you preach without joy. And I've never seen you backlash and get back at the people. I've not, you've just kept on going in the middle of this. And I don't know how true that is. That was his perspective. Then he pulls out an envelope and he slides it over to me, and there was a $50,000 check in that envelope. And he said, I want to let you know I'm in. And I started crying. I said, we got down to $100 in the bank account, Vinny. You like, I'm getting emotional now. I'm like, you have no idea what this means for me. He said, I didn't know that. How come you didn't tell the congregation? Because I was not going to give in, and I was not going to let people know that their dollars are the reason that I'm here. I'll eat dog food for Jesus if he calls me to do it. And Jesus saved me. And Vinny said, you'll never have to worry about that again. He's one of the richest business leaders in our area. He put our church's name on all his business accounts, and probably the last year he's given $250,000. That happened because I and some of our leaders dared to stand in the gap of change and say, hell or high water, we're reaching this community for Jesus. We're reaching this community for Jesus. That's what's going to happen. And nothing's going to stop it.
Awesome, man. What a great start to the Institute, you guys, right? This has been awesome. Appreciate it. Appreciate it very much.
Yeah.
We'll be back here. We got, I think, what's the date? Maybe a couple. What's our next Institute? Put that slide up. I can't remember. There's also, I have posters. If you didn't get a poster at your church, or if you want one in your dorm room, I've got some over there at that table. So Ryan, here we go. Ryan's October 3rd, a second. I can read. And it's going to be great. So this is just the beginning. We got another 9 folks to come through this year. Really excited about it. Thank you so much for coming. Ian would love to chat with you afterwards.
Yeah, I'll be around hanging out.
So come on up. Please buy a book if you're interested. $10 in the back. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.